Hello, and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out to the southwest of Novomikhailivka, where there has been this small advance by the Russians in a western direction. We see here that the Russians are not just focusing on the fighting here by Novomikhailivka, but are also advancing here in the southern parts, which we have seen over the past few weeks. So what we're seeing is that the Russians are generally advancing towards this road here between Konstantinivka and Vuhledar. This is also in combination to the small advancement that happened to the east of Vuhledar and the fighting by Novomikhailivka. It seems that the Russians are focusing on the towns themselves, like Vuhledar and Konstantinivka, by going through Novomikhailivka and advancing here to the east of Vuhledar, and at the same time then pushing it through the center towards the road itself. The Russians are likely planning to cut off the support between the two sides so that they can focus on whichever is the most vulnerable, taking control of that and cutting off the supply lines for the other one, which is more difficult, which is Vuhledar. So the Russians are likely going to push further westwards here in the direction of Novomikhailivka to capture the town and then move further westwards until they reach Konstantinivka to try and capture that as well, before moving southern direction towards Vuhledar, having cut off its supplies by holding Pavlivka to the south and cutting off the road here in the center and capturing Konstantinivka in the north. So there is this whole operation here to the south of Marinka, purely focused around taking Vuhledar, and all of these other parts are just steps towards that process, as the Ukrainian positions in Vuhledar are extremely powerful. Moving further north, we have some developments here in the direction of Pervomaiske to the west of Donetsk. From this, we see that the Russians have managed to capture this road between the northern and southern parts, and with this, they have full control over this line right here. The Ukrainians still have positions here in the forest lines to the south of Pervomaiske, so the Russians would have a difficulty advancing further in this section. But we do see that the Russians have made a significant advance within the town itself. As we see here, the Russians have made an advance from the northern parts into the central parts and likely combine that with an assault from the southern parts. And with that, we see that the Russians have made a significant process within the town, and they'll likely continue pushing until they reach the central parts of it and the final parts of it, capturing the town itself. So we're seeing that there has been process throughout the early stages of February as well as throughout the late stages of January. And with these advancements, the Russians are developing a offensive towards the capture of the town. And with the currently held positions by the Russians in the northern parts of Pervomaiske, they could launch assaults from the central parts in the northern flank of the Ukrainian positions. They could pass straight through, or they could even provide cover support from the northern parts. So with this, we see that the Russians are having favorable positions to the north, allowing them to cover for some of the Russian positions if they decide to storm the town itself. There's also the final parts that the Russians need to take control of to the north of the river line, which they haven't yet. So there's also just continuous possibilities of Russian advances in the northern parts as they look to attack the Ukrainian positions there. So there is this constant efforts by the Russians to develop the situation in Pervomaiske, and as we've seen that there has been significant developments throughout January and February, and as such the Russians have managed to capture this whole section right here, and they are continuously advancing in a northern direction to capture the rest of the town. Capturing Pervomaiske would lead them to a position where they can continue advancing westwards until Nitailove, and if they capture that as well, they will have cut off the whole southern parts here to the west of Donetsk. If they then capture Donetsk as well, they will have a huge gap between the positions in Donetsk in a northwestern direction. Then there is the town of Krasnohorivka here to the south of that. They need to capture as well. Capturing both of these would allow them to have a huge buffer area to the west of Donetsk. Capturing Avdiivka and the surrounding villages would allow them to have a significant buffer all around in every direction of Donetsk, leaving it completely safe from all artillery strikes and most multi-launch rocket strikes. And pretty much there will be little to no strikes towards Donetsk itself, which will allow the Russians to build up large military operations here in this direction, and also for the Russians to receive a huge morale boost because the city of Donetsk has been under shelling by the Ukrainian forces, and this shelling has been a major propaganda issue for the Russians because publicly having the Ukrainians shell an area such as big as Donetsk with almost 1 million inhabitants, if not more, is a very huge issue for the Russians. So them relieving the local population of any shelling would add a significant increase in the morale of the fighting soldiers, because they feel like that they are achieving some of their goals, which they haven't achieved yet. And that was, as Putin said in his interview with Tucker Carlson, when Tucker Carlson asked, "Have your goals in Ukraine been met yet?" He said no. And that is, as we can see, the Russians need to gain full control over the Donetsk region. And then at that point, the majority of the goals can be reached. But most importantly for the Russians is just getting Avdiivka under their control, and getting these buffer zones under control would lead to a larger morale boost of the Russians than any of the other captures, because the fighting itself, the invasion itself, is justified based on Donetsk. The city itself is the main reason for the war, and that is why this has a huge impact on the morale. The developments within the city of Avdiivka itself was covered in a previous video, but what we're seeing is that the fighting is taking place here in the northwestern parts of the city, as well as in the central parts, where the Russians are looking to advance in all directions, physically cut off the supply road, and the city itself is in a operational encirclement, as the Ukrainians cannot supply or resupply and reinforcements or whatever without being under fire by Russian forces, and therefore it is called an operational encirclement. The physical cutting of the road would lead to a full encirclement, but that would need Russians to either get control over the citadel area or to keep control over Sheverne and Tonenke here to the west of Avdiivka, which hasn't happened yet. Therefore, it is still just an operational encirclement rather than a full encirclement. There's also the fact that the Russians need to cross these final 300 meters before they can cut off the main road here to the north. But with these developments in Avdiivka, we move on to the Klishchiivka direction, where there's been a small advancement by the Russians. This is the only reason this is worth mentioning is because we are seeing that the Ukrainians launched an attack here across the river line, and now the Russians are flanking those positions by attacking through the railways. So we're likely going to see further attacks by the Russians in this section to try and regain full control over the railways after the Battle of Klishchiivka enters a new stage. And that is exactly what I'm talking about with the northern flank of Bakhmut, with the developments where the Russians captured the forest patch here to the north of Ivanivsk. They switched to a lot of shelling of Ukrainian positions, specifically around Ivanivsk, the surrounding areas of the forest patch area, and towards Chasiv. The main reason for this is the Russians are now looking to advance through Bogdanivka and possibly launch an assault towards Ivanivsk to move from Bakhmut towards the canal. Capturing this whole section of the front would allow them to pretty much significantly weaken the Ukrainian supplies in and out of Klishchiivka, and it would pretty much cut off the southern flank of Bakhmut on the Ukrainian side from supplies. So we will see the 98th Guards Division launching further attacks in the western direction as they try to capture these villages and towns, and they want to cut off the Ukrainians here to the east of the canal line before developing an assault towards Chasiv itself. Due to the heavy forest area here to the southeast of Chasiv, there is the possibility that the Russians can simply move through the forested areas, launching assaults through them to cross the canal line and subsequently launch attacks towards Chasiv with these assault groups, similar to what happened in the Avdiivka direction. And with that, we may see the Russians simply getting a couple of bridgeheads across the forested areas. We do see that by the canal line itself, there's an open area that they'll have passed through. The Ukrainians will likely have 24/7 monitoring of these areas, so it would be under cover of heavy artillery fire. But it is likely that the Russians are planning on capturing Ivanivsk, Bogdanivka, Kaliningrad, and capturing everything here to the east of the canal line and developing an offensive towards Chasiv after the fall of Bakhmut on the 20th of May 2023. This will be the first real offensive operations by the Russians since then. Moving further north, there has been no developments, and as such we see that the Russians are generally launching these offensive operations throughout the front line, advancing in at rate at which there is just constant advancements by the Russians throughout the day. And the main reason for this is, as is reported in this article here by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, they talk about the decline of military aid, or the impact of ending military aid to Ukraine, The gradual decline, then collapse. First off, he answers the question, why is military aid needed? The main reason for that is a constant supply line that is needed for a military to fight. For example, during the Ukrainian counteroffensive, they launched about 6,000 artillery shells every day. Now they're firing about 2,000. The reason for the military aid being needed is if the Ukrainians simply stop receiving military artillery rounds, then they will need to choose their targets carefully, because then they will have to shoot a way less than 2,000 shells a day to keep it at a steady rate. Military loses equipment at a steady rate. Without replacements, units lose firepower. That means relying more on humans and suffering higher casualties. That's pretty much what we'll see. If the Ukrainians run out of tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, armored personnel carriers, and so on, they would need to move to the front line on civilian cars, or simply to walk to the front line. Both increases significantly the amount of casualties they take. What aid does the United States provide to Ukraine? That is pretty much everything. What is included in the United States military aid? Again, pretty much everything. What military aid has the United States committed to? Right now, pretty much nothing. And as we can see here, zero. The main reason for that is the budget, which ended, the fiscal year of the United States ended in October 2023. They still had some money left over from the previous budget, which allowed them to continue aid here until November. But as we see, it's $300 million, $225 million, and somewhere around that. And in the end, now it's completely zero. Nothing has been sent in January, and nothing will be sent in February. And as long as no new package is sent, they'll continue being zero. The United States has completely run out. But not just that, we can also see that pretty much since August, the amount of aid being sent has significantly declined since the end of the Ukrainian offensive. And as such, we see that there's hardly any aid being sent since August, much less the zero what we're seeing now since January. So throughout 2024, if no new aid is being sent, Ukraine will simply not receive any. And what we're seeing right now is the European Union has promised aid, but the 60 billion package is over 4 years. That means 15 billion a year. And it's mostly just financial aid for the Ukrainian government to function during this time of war. That means there's hardly any military aid in that package. The most military aid being sent from the European Union is by individual countries themselves, which have pretty much sent most of what they are able to send. Like the shells that we saw the European Union promise Ukraine, which was 1 million, they've sent only half of that because they simply do not have the production capability to send more than that. So even at that rate, if we say 500,000 a year, that is a little over 1,000 shells a day. It is somewhere around 1.3, 1.4 thousand shells a day, which is hardly enough for Ukraine, which is spending 6,000 a day while on the offensive and 2,000 on the defensive. So it's not even enough to cover the Ukrainian usage when they are saving shells. So they cannot save shells, which means that the Ukrainians simply cannot prepare for a new offensive because they do not even have enough shells to defend. And if they do not use enough shells to defend, then the front line will simply be at risk of collapse, because the Russians could do more risky operations. They can launch more assaults. Similar to what we're seeing here in Avdiivka, the majority of these advancements took place because the Ukrainians are simply running low on shells. What they're able to fire is simply not enough to hold back the Russians, and therefore we're seeing that despite all of the Ukrainian efforts to hold the city and defending it for every single inch, they are not succeeding in holding back the Russians, and they are being pushed back throughout the front line, with the number of advancements by the Russians increasing significantly throughout the month of January. We already see just the 10th of February alone, we saw 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 individual advancements by the Russians, which shows that there has been a significant increase, keeping it at 10 a day for 29 days. That'll add up to 290 advances throughout the month of February, which will eventually lead to a collapse of the Ukrainian front. So without additional aid coming to Ukraine, especially a massive aid package from the United States, it becomes increasingly difficult for the Ukrainians to even defend, much less launch their own offensive operations. And as such, the Ukrainians are just on a straight line to defeat, as long as no significant package is being sent. So the Ukrainians would need to either get a package soon or simply negotiate a peace deal, because those are the two best outcomes for Ukraine, either getting a package so they can continue fighting or negotiating a peace. Without new aid package, it is pretty much impossible for Ukraine to have a shot, even a small percentage of winning, because without weapons, you cannot fight a war. Without logistics, without supplies, you cannot fight a war. So in the end, Ukraine is in a gradual decline and could lead to collapse if they do not get significant aid, and that is not scheduled for them right now. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching and have a great day.